Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinars on the topic of pandemics and migrant workers, coaching experiences and responses. My name is Dara from Inside Park, and I will be ensuring that you have a smooth experience with Zoom today. Our panelists are very excited to be sharing their thoughts with you today. And after the panelists speak, there will be a Q&A session. During that time, please send your question into the Q&A window, which you can find by clicking the button that says Q&A on the bottom of your screen. And the moderator, Sean, will be looking at the questions submitted here. And I would like to announce that for this webinar, the chat function is visible. And if you have any question, please submit it to the Q&A window. And the question in the Q&A window will be considered for answering only. Additionally, you can also discuss about this topic on social media by using the hashtag RBHRF 2020. And I will put this in the chat as a public announcement. And another thing is that constantly I will be putting a public announcement to remind that you can put question in the Q&A window. So now I would like to hand the floor to our moderator, Sean, to take this discussion from now.
Thank you very much, Dara, and welcome everyone to this session on pandemics and migration, gauging experiences and responses. My name is Sean Lees, and I'm a business and human rights specialist for UNDP based here in Bangkok. I will be your moderator today, as Dara has stated. I'm joined here today by an illustrious panel of 5 people. Anna Engblom, the Chief Technical Advisor for the ILO on the Triangle in ASEAN program. Mr. Maung Maung, President of the Confederation of Trade Unions of Myanmar. Ms. Suani Dola, Program Officer from Rakstai Foundation. Minoli Don, Head of Migrant Assistance Unit at IOM Sri Lanka. And Mr. Matthias Torns, Deputy Secretary General of the International Organization of Employers. Welcome, everyone. To our audience, we've had a few housekeeping comments made already, made by Dara. I won't go over them again, but just to say that we have over 2,000 people registered for this session. And so managing the chat room can be very difficult. And for that reason, the chat room will not be visible. The Q&A board will be curated by my colleague, Anna Keller, and she will be sending those questions that are the most relevant and also the most novel. So please present questions that you think haven't been asked already or certainly haven't been answered already. Looking forward to those questions. Now the Q&A period will follow our conversation with the 5 panelists. We will give them about 10 minutes each to respond to several questions. That Q&A period will happen about 50 minutes into our conversation today. In our session today, we want to respond to 2 major concerns. First, how have migrant workers fared under COVID-19 in Asia? And secondly, from the standpoint of migrant worker rights and well-being, how do we build back better after COVID-19? Now, allow me a short remark on the title of this session. Indeed, it starts off with pandemics and migrant workers, not COVID-19 and migrant workers. And that's the use of the term pandemics as a plural is purposeful. So much attention has been placed on COVID-19 because of its scale, because of its intensity, that some of us tend to forget that pandemics have been with us since antiquity. We can go back thousands of years to ancient Egypt. We can go to ancient Rome and the Roman Empire and how it impacted that era. Catherine the Great in Russia. More recently, the Asian flu, 1957. H1N1 in 2009 and 2010, and of course, COVID-19 on a global scale today. The point here is not to depress us, scare us, worry us, but in fact to redouble our efforts, to get us to redouble our efforts to ensure that when we have another pandemic, either as a second wave or as a completely new virus, that we are ready, and that we are ready to mitigate the harms that might be impacting on migrant workers in all regions of the world. I'm lucky enough to live in Thailand, where under a phased approach, we're slowly opening. Restaurants are open, beaches have been opened recently. Very lucky indeed that this government has provided such a well-structured means of managing the pandemic on its shores. Interestingly, over the last 3 phases since March, the construction industry here kept on humming right along. And of course, many of you are aware that this is an industry largely populated by indeed largely populated by migrant laborers from Cambodia, from Myanmar, and from Laos. As you also know, many of the economies here in my region in Southeast Asia are powered by migrant labor and their remittances. And yet these migrants are some of the most vulnerable workers there are today. So our panel will help unpack the challenges these migrants are facing during COVID-19 circumstances, provide us some details. I'm looking for up-to-date information. I'm looking for information that you haven't already read about in journals or in policy pieces. But they're also going to define solutions already underway. Let's begin. Anna Engblom is, as I said, the ILO's chief technical advisor to the ASEAN Triangle Program. I'd like to start with her to give us a view of the regional picture, focused again on Southeast Asia. Anna, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sean, for this important question. And I'd also like to thank the organizers for recognizing the importance of labor migration and including it in the agenda in the discussions of the next few days. It's a real pleasure to be here on behalf of the ILO. So back to your question. Well, the ILO estimate that close to 11% of all working hours globally, which is equal to 305 million jobs, will be globally during the second quarter due to the COVID crisis. There are, of course, no official figures available yet, so we don't know how this is going to impact migrant workers. But we do know that migrants are among the first to lose their jobs in crisis situations like this. There are currently some 10 million migrants working within the ASEAN region. And if the ILO estimates are correct, then we will lose 10% of all working hours. It's clear that this will impact migrants and their families very hard. You mentioned remittances, and I mean, we see already, and we will continue to see a reduction in remittances going back to the countries of origin. There are also a couple of reasons why we believe that migrant workers will be harder hit than national workers. And first, Southeast Asia migrants are typically working in low-skilled occupations. You mentioned the sectors, construction, of course, manufacturing, agriculture and agri-processing, services, including tourism and domestic work. And some of these sectors are harder hit than others of the economic impact of COVID, of course. But let me give an example. Domestic workers, for example, are particularly hard hit, as many households have ended their contract or suspended them without salary during the crisis. There was an interesting story in Times of India last week that reported that 85% of all domestic workers were not being paid during the current lockdown. Secondly, we know that even before the current crisis hit us, migrant workers were among the most vulnerable and least protected of all workers in Southeast Asia, as they work in jobs and sectors that are temporary, they are informal, and they are generally unprotected with low wages and lack of social protection. We also see reports of rising level of discrimination against migrants, and in some countries, we unfortunately see that employers are even encouraged to terminate employment contracts of migrant workers first, so that unemployment among the national workers can be kept as small as possible. So very broadly, at this stage of the pandemic, I think that there are three groups of migrant workers. It's those that are still employed, it's those that remain in the countries of destination but have lost their jobs, and it's those that have been able to go back home to their home countries. And of course, the challenges that they are facing is quite different. And while it's hard to generalize, I think that those that have lost their jobs but are unable to go home are perhaps the hardest affected, as they're not only losing their income and potentially their accommodation if that is provided by the employer, but they are also at risk of losing their legal status, as visas and work permits are linked to employment. In some countries like Thailand, for example, the government has addressed this in a very positive manner and have extended deadlines for renewals of work permits and visas to ensure that migrants can retain the legal status and are not becoming informal or irregular. We also see that those that are able to keep the jobs are facing challenges linked to the COVID crisis. These are primarily deteriorating working conditions, such as having to accept pay cuts, inability to refuse to work during lockdowns, etc. Finally, those that have been able to return home also have challenges linked to quality of services in compulsory quarantine centers, indebtedness linked to recruitment costs that they had to pay, and of course, the very big question about how to find local jobs, waiting for potentially new opportunities to migrate with an unemployment rising in the countries of origin. I'm sorry, Sean, I'm leaving you with a long list of problems, but I'm afraid this is the situation that we are facing on the ground right now.
Thank you very much for that review. ILO has been working with migrant laborers for decades, and I know with other partners, including IOM, even in some cases UNDP, but certainly with governments, have been investing a lot of resources in improving migration governance. Our systems, our institutions are all being tested by COVID-19. What did the COVID-19 pandemic reveal about the investments you've made in migration governance alongside governments? And how have those investments stood up to the challenge?
Right. Yeah, it's correct that there's been a lot of focus on the need to improve labor migration governance over the past decades. We see this in the Sustainable Development Goals, where the need to protect migrant workers is recognized. And of course, the very important adoption of the 2018 Global Compact for safe, orderly and regular migration that address all aspects of migration, not only labor migration. Also in our region, we see that the ASEAN leaders are committed to improve the situation for migrant workers. This is demonstrated in the adoption of the ASEAN Declaration on the Protection of the Rights of Migrant Workers and reaffirmed again in the signing of the ASEAN Consensus in 2017. Interestingly, the ASEAN leaders have decided that this year the ASEAN Forum on Migrant Labor, which is convened by the ASEAN Committee on the Protection of Migrant Workers, will discuss how to support migrant workers during the current pandemic, but also similar potential pandemics in the future, and will develop a set of ASEAN-wide recommendations on this topic. So these are global and regional commitments. We do see that these translate into national action over the years. We've seen good improvements in legal protection framework in the region. There has been expansion of coverage of social protection, for example. And we also see movements towards fairer recruitment and increased recognitions of the principle of zero recruitment cost for migrant workers. But this is still a bit in the future. But I think to answer, maybe now I will start to answer your question. I think that the current crisis has deepened and emphasized some of the key protection gaps that we saw also before the COVID crisis. And there are a few, but I would like to single out three that I think are particularly important. The first is the key issue about migrant workers' access to social protection and health services. Has been some progress, but we do need to continue our work to ensure that migrants have the same access to health services and social protection coverage, including testing and treatment as national workers. And to this, I think the issue of portability of social protection is also very important. Many governments, including those in Southeast Asia, have signed bilateral agreements on portability of certain benefits, but until today, no such agreements are in place between countries in Southeast Asia. So portability is I think, an area we need to work more on. Access to justice is another important area. We do see that there are labor abuses and exploitation happening in the time of COVID, and we need to ensure that all migrant workers have access to legal remedies. The ILO is supporting governments, trade unions, and CSO partners to run what we call migrant worker resource centers throughout ASEAN, and these are providing safe migration information, and importantly, legal support to migrants in countries of origin and destination. And I think this is a model that proves itself over and over to be useful and provide services in high demand of migrants. And the last area, yeah, one more point.
30 seconds more, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So the last area, which I think is very important, is the issue about migrant workers' housing. And this has perhaps not been so much addressed before, but we see now in Singapore, to some extent in Malaysia, perhaps, particularly in Middle East as well, that migrants are living in cramped living quarters, and these are potential breeding grounds for infections. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you, Anna. Some key takeaways for me is really at towards the end there, the need added focus on access to health services, social protection. We need more focus there, portability of benefits and access to justice. I'm glad to hear more about the centers, that you're finding them so effective, and I hope that that they are fully capacitated to manage the crisis, especially as we may have, as we've said, a second wave and or another pandemic around the corner that none of us are ready for. Thank you so much, Anna. If I may, we're going to move to our next speaker, who is widely respected by trade unionists and human rights advocates throughout the world as the foremost expert on and authority on labor rights in Myanmar. Welcome, Umang, to this discussion. I see you on mute. I'm about to go into a question, so maybe you want to unmute yourself here. Umang, if you don't mind, give us a brief profile. Now that we've got the regional look, give us a brief profile or overview of the Myanmar migrant worker population in Southeast Asia and elsewhere. And please provide us with a profile of the industries and countries that the Burmese migrants are currently living in. Thank you.
Well, at the moment, thank you, Sean. At the moment, we have about, according to the IOM, it's about 1.6 million migrants in Thailand, and 1.3, I think, are actually people who are trying to register or registered. So I would say it's a big community, people going out from Burma to Thailand and to China and to India. Most of the migrations are documented with Thailand. It's a little bit difficult trying to document with China and India. Having said that, people have been wondering how many migrants from Thailand have come back. According to the Ministry of Labor, with the permanent secretary that I just talked this morning, it's only about 65,000 has returned from Thailand officially. So these are people who are on record. And from China, it's about 17,000. India is unaccounted because it can't be from many directions. So it's a lot, quite a lot of difficulties. But the good thing is that most of the returning migrants, I would say the majority, are being quarantined. So people who, whether all the people who come back in, who are whether they are registered migrants or unregistered migrants, all of them are quarantined, and I think we do have a good, let's say, system in trying to identify who is infected and who is not. So I would say that's where we are. Then the good thing is that on their return, the Ministry of Labor is documenting them, trying to get documentation on the skills also. Because this is something that we all have agreed that we should identify their skills and their experience, so that when we're talking about employment issues and jobs opening up, these data can be used to help with that kind of a process. So that's where we are at the moment.
That's interesting that when you're documenting the skills, are you finding any specific kind of skill that's allowing Burmese migrants to deploy those skills in the country of origin in Myanmar itself?
We don't know yet because we didn't have any jobs. That's why people migrated. But I would say
Indeed.
the government is now trying to push forward with the construction sector and the agriculture sector, which could employ more people without having to have specific skills. So I think this is what the what you call this emergency response and recovery committee is doing.
Okay, excellent. When you talk to returnees, or when you talk to migrant laborers, Burmese migrant laborers, whether they be in Thailand, India, or China, what is their biggest concern during this COVID-19 period? And do you see a difference between what those concerns are, depending upon what country they are currently in or that have worked in previously?
I would say everybody has got the same concern about being able to get their jobs back. They are frustrated with having to come back without any planning, just like everybody. Whether they're coming back from China or from Thailand or from India or Malaysia, everybody had to spend a lot of money to get there. Then all of a sudden they have to come back, so they are frustrated in losing their jobs, and also they don't know what is going to happen to their savings regarding the social contribution that they had to put regarding social security and things like that. So they are frustrated on what they don't know. Because I think almost everybody doesn't know whether their jobs will be available again or whether they can go back because of the COVID-19 quarantine process and things like that. So that's where they are.
Indeed.
And if I may, Sean, just to follow up on what Anna was saying, I agree with what Anna was saying regarding things we have to do. But for us, the most important thing is that the governments, the region, especially Cambodia, Thailand, CLMTV countries, have agreed to the portable social security. And I think this COVID-19 pandemic is a very bad example. We need to get this thing done. Have had more than enough meetings, what you call the surveys, discussions, agreements, and this is time that we put this in place, and this is for the benefit of everybody. That would be my point.
Yeah, thank you. When you reference that people are worried about their savings they put in Social Security, I believe you mean in Thailand, is that correct? There is a scheme there.
In Thailand. That's in Thailand.
Interesting. I'm wondering too, and related to that, there was an MOU that was signed between Thailand and Myanmar in recent years about the protection and repatriation of migrant workers to and from Myanmar. Tell me, is that MOU enabling any responses that you have enabling safe returns, and is it working out? Is it shown to have this sort of has the MOU helped in any way in adapting to COVID-19 and the sudden urge or need for people to either return or to what have you? Is the MOU still relevant between Thailand and Myanmar in terms of governing migrant returns?
Well, Sean, I would say that this COVID-19 made everything irrelevant. I would say people could not go through all the procedures or the steps that you are supposed to take. Everybody had to take immediate solutions. For example, for the migrants who come back, they had some difficulties coming across the province. But what was not is a government arranged for buses to come directly from Bangkok to Mae Sot, let's say escorted. They didn't stop on the way. So that the migrants could come to those buses and they could cross the provinces. So I would say this COVID-19 is something that we are getting headache, that whatever we thought of sometimes doesn't apply. And I think I would say the MOU is still relevant, but this pandemic really made things people respond in a much faster in ways that were not in the agreement.
And for those of you in our audience that don't understand the reference to Mae Sot, Mae Sot is a small city just a town when I lived nearby, but a small city where there's a major immigration, where there's a bridge going over the Salaween River that many migrants cross back and forth. So just so people understand that reference. Thank you, Umang, for your intervention. And I'm sure there's a lot of questions going to be coming in with regards to your expertise. My next speaker, thank you. My next speaker is Sunwani Dola, who is the program officer for Rax Thai Foundation. Kun Sawani, Sawadi Krap. Sawani, you've worked with migrant populations in the seafood and agricultural sectors in Thailand for some time now. I want to focus a little bit more on, not necessarily on migration between two different countries or within countries, but about their access to health and justice services. As Anna and Umang pointed out, access to social protection, but also access to essential health services and justice are focus areas of concern for migrants. In your experience working with migrants in Thailand, are they seeking access to remedies for any harms they've suffered during the COVID-19 period? Are they seeking access to healthcare? And what's been their experience so far?
Okay, so as you may have already know that Thai government respond to COVID-19 outbreak by imposing the state of emergency order since late March, and with list of prohibition include prohibiting public gathering, imposing curfews, and news censorship, which is now extended to remain in force until the end of this month. So resulting from that, many businesses must be closed. Workers have stopped working, and this causes big migration in both Thai and non-Thai actually. Not just migrant workers, but then workers have to stop working, and this caused big migration, as I mentioned. But then later on in early April, there's another preventive measures to close borders of Thailand and neighboring countries, leave migrant workers stranded and stuck without or less income. So apart from food shortage and homelessness, accessing to healthcare and government compensation package led migrant workers to be most hit by the impact of the pandemic, as all post-process relied mainly on their legal status. So data from our field work suggests that there was approximately half of migrant workers that are undocumented, which a majority of them were women and children. So on the issues of healthcare, I would like to point out into two different parts. The first part is the prevention, and the second part is the treatment. So during this pandemic, we had interviewed many workers, and only those with documentation were confident that they could receive treatment if they fell ill from COVID-19. Even though in fact, like the Thai government has announced that close contact of patients that are diagnosed with the COVID-19 and those show symptoms of COVID-19 can get examination for free of charge at any government hospital nearby their areas. And if the result came out that it is positive, then they can get free treatment as well. But this emerged finding suggests that like many migrants did not know this information. So they tend to avoid going to the hospital, and because they were beforehand, like if they are undocumented, then they're afraid of being sent back home or deported. But then during this COVID-19, like everyone who feel that they are like having some symptoms of COVID-19, they can just go to the hospital. But this piece of information is not well disseminated among migrant workers. And another piece of information that we do during our rapid situation assessment that we conduct in collaboration with migrant working group partner found that 71.73% of migrants access information online, but in our deeper in our rapid gender assessment, we have an opportunity to talk deeply with the migrant workers, and then we found out that not all of them have the access to phone, especially the undocumented migrant, because for one to own a cell phone, they have to have a proper like a valid identification card to register to have a phone. So they kind of like depend mainly on their friends or the word of mouth. So that's a myth as well, that like they might get contagious from going to the hospital. So even though some are sick, they are trying to avoid going to the hospital, but instead they go to private clinic, which end up they pay around 30 USD, which is a lot compared to their income, right?
Yeah.
And for other form of assistance that the Thai government provide to migrant worker is only compensation for unemployed case, but limited to only those with social security that Umang has formally like mentioned about. And most cases get like end up not getting any compensation because they didn't meet the whole criteria, like the business need to close down and so on, and there must be some signature from the employer. So I don't want to bore you on that specific point, but this is how the situation be like.
And I might have missed it, but I don't think so. What about access to justice services? Are you finding that people, like maybe in pursuit of social security benefits or social benefits, have tried to go to courts, or maybe even tried bringing their employers to the attention of formal mediation providers?
Okay, so actually like that's two separate platforms that migrant can get justice like process in Thailand. If it's based on their labor, on their employment, then they will have to go file their complaints to Social Protection and Welfare Office. But if it's other forms of like harassment or criminal cases, then it will be pursued through court. But then like, I mean, for for the stranded, like unemployed, that they go to the Social Protection and Welfare Office is tend to be that like when look back to their contract and so on, it's end up that they didn't really get the help that they needed. But to go to court, the process is not limited, like they can just go to court. But the problem is the mobility at the moment, that all the public transportation, more on the facility problems, not the process of getting the justice from the court. Is it answer the question?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, mobility itself is it's the fundamental thing that keeping many people from all kinds of services, migrant laborers, of course, but even other vulnerable groups, both in any country currently in Southeast Asia and South Asia. I just want to plug the CSO survey that UNDP has done with Oxfam and Forum Asia. Has done a lot of gotten a lot of feedback from civil society organizations like Roxtai about how the details of how mobility has impacted their lives, and it's absolutely devastating, the results. I encourage people to look for that CSO survey on UNDP's website. Again, something we did closely with Oxfam and Forum Asia. Quickly, Sunwani, we have 30 seconds left. Tell me what should be the immediate, medium, and long-term priorities of the government and businesses to address the concerns you've raised in terms of access to services.
From my point of view as a nonprofit officer that work closely with migrant workers, that what government needed to put as immediate priority would be surely measures to ensure that no one leave without food, housing, and medication if needed. Also, collaboration between government of host country, in my case Thailand, and sending countries like Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia must be take place to ensure safe repatriation for migrant workers who will to go home. And last but not least is the inclusive information dissemination, and for business to put as per immediate priority would be the assisting in needed workers on basic human needs and provide sufficient protective equipment such as face masks and hand sanitizer would also help the migrant workers a lot because it's just an extra cost on their very low income. And for medium priority, which I believe we are now in that phase, the government should facilitate or pair unemployed worker with business that is in need of workforce to create win-win situation for both, workers and business sector. That as like I work in the field, keep hearing migrant crying for help as they lost job, and then the news like on the other hand saying that migrant workers are still needed in several fields of work. So like help pairing as would be like the solution that need to be takes place. But in longer run, I think this pandemic made many agencies in charge to rethink about universal health coverage and beyond healthcare benefit of social security scheme of workers is necessary for like the business sector. This is also crucial for all levels of business sector to relook at the good labor practice, starting from recruitment process, better working condition during employment and employment welfare. We have heard from like many business sectors that we work with that like during this pandemic that they started to employ the temperature screening before coming to work and stuff like that. The rate of calling for sick leave is reduced. So I mean like happy workplace with in the longer run help to develop the quality of work as well. Yes.
I like how you've ended with this the notion and or the encouragement to work closely with businesses and things like pairing employers with migrant workers who are currently out of work is an inspired one. And of course, your message about information dissemination, how if migrants don't have the information to access the health services or to access other justice services or what have you, then it makes no sense to provide them. They need to know about them in order to utilize. We've heard, thank you so much, Sonlani. I appreciate your comments today, as I'm sure most of our audience has as well. We've spoken a lot about the Southeast Asia context, but we need to look now across the Indian Ocean to South Asia and understand better the situation there, because every country, every region has a different experience with regards to the impact of COVID-19. To assist us in understanding the South Asia scenario, we have with us today Manoli Don, head of the Migration Assistance Unit, based in Sri Lanka and working for the International Organization for Migration in Colombo. Welcome, Manoli.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you very much for the organizers as well for having me. And it's a great pleasure to represent International Organization for Migration in this panel.
It's our pleasure. Manoli, there's been a lot of work around safe migration over the years. As we've said earlier in our conversation with Anna, there's been a focus on recruitment fees, withholding of documentation, unfair payment practices, of course, living wage issues as well. These have been at the core of focus in prior years and past years. But in COVID-19, we did see more prominence placed on migrant housing, again, as Anna underlined, and access to healthcare. But we haven't spoken yet about stranded workers in any great detail, although Umang did mention the need to ensure facilitated returns, like on buses from Bangkok to Mae Sot. Tell us about Sri Lanka's migrant situation and the unique challenges provided there, or not provided there, sorry, the challenges presented there. In fact, tell us a little bit about the Sri Lankan migrant experience in destination countries. What have their experiences been? And what measures could the government of Sri Lanka and other South Asian countries be taking to assist stranded migrant workers?
Thank you very much, Sean. We all know that COVID-19 pandemic has created serious and disproportionate effects on the migrant workers. If we take Sri Lanka, a little bit of background, Sri Lanka Bureau for Foreign Employment is the principal regulator when it comes to labor migration in Sri Lanka. Approximately 150,000 to 200,000 migrant workers migrate for employment every year. And 55% of these migrant workers, according to 2018 statistics, are employed in low-skilled, semi-skilled domestic worker categories. Migrant worker remittances enormously contribute to country's economy, and it accounts for 8.1% of country's GDP. So it's important that concrete measures are in place to protect and safeguard the rights of the migrant workers. So the issues that we have come across, IOM globally and also IOM Sri Lanka, we closely work with the government and non-governmental stakeholders. We closely work with the civil society partners, destination missions, embassies, consulates in destination countries. We have also conducted a rapid assessment recently, and we have hotlines of operation. We hear direct stories about the plight of the migrant workers in destination countries. One of the key issues shown is the impact on employment. Many of these migrant workers have lost their employment. Some have been paid partially, some haven't been paid at all, and some are in a state of limbo. They don't know what will happen next. So the economic impact will inevitably have an impact on accessing the basic services such as food, accommodation. Some are unable to pay for their rent and they don't have accommodation at all. And some have been housed at embassy shelters. This is what we've been hearing. And also, I think the healthcare systems, especially the low-skilled, semi-skilled domestic worker categories, are rarely covered by destination countries' labor laws, domestic laws, social protection schemes. They don't have access to insurance or medical schemes. So these are some of the key challenges that they have been experiencing at the moment. If you take irregular migrants, especially in the Middle Eastern region, in Gulf countries, the employment status is often linked to the sponsorship system or also the kafala system. So the moment you lose your employment status, you lose basically your legal right to stay in that country and you immediately become undocumented. So this is a serious effect and that has to be taken into consideration. Sri Lankan government, of course, has taken some progressive steps as soon as the pandemic started in the country. And there's an online portal called Contact Sri Lanka launched by the Ministry of Foreign Relations. And since its launch in March, the website, where the web portal has seen over, I think, 60,000 registrations, and majority of these requests through the portal come from the migrant workers who are stranded in the Middle Eastern region. So the portal or the Ministry of Foreign Relations try to connect these stranded migrants to the embassies, consulates in the destination countries and to other supportive networks. So in case of irregular migrants, undocumented migrants, what happens is now they're anyway, usually they're engaged in informal sector. They get paid daily and most of them have lost their jobs. And due to their irregular status, they are unable to come forward and seek help. Even if they are not well, they don't want to go and have access to medical services, health services, due to fear of arrest, detention, and being deported. To take migrant workers also, these categories of migrant workers are in densely concentrated accommodation, in dormitories. The risk of transmission is really high in these areas, so these factors need to be taken into consideration. In addition to that, I would like to highlight the plight of the domestic worker category. They are at increased risk of exploitation and are being subjected to human trafficking. Especially during the lockdown, many countries have imposed curfew. There are mobility restrictions. These individuals are confined to the employers' homes. Even in case of abuse, exploitation, they're unable to escape these abusive conditions. They can't go out of the house. They can't reach supportive networks. They can't communicate with their families, due to communication issues or the other challenges that they're facing. So these are some of the key issues that we have come across and we have been hearing from migrant workers.
And you
also, let me also,
please.
About the amnesties. I think recently Kuwait government and Lebanon declared amnesties and it was open for a period of 30 days, if I'm not mistaken, and all the undocumented migrant workers were given an opportunity to come forward and register, for repatriation. And they were told that, they can leave the country without any penalties and any bans on readmission. So some of the Sri Lankan migrant workers who were in Kuwait were able to have access to this opportunity, and they made use of this opportunity. Yes.
Were these repatriation is offered to this amnesty, whether it's through an amnesty or some other provision? I mean, when we're talking about repatriation, are these employer-funded repatriations, or is this at the cost of the migrant worker?
In the case of Kuwait, the Kuwait government bore the entire cost of repatriation. They bore the airfare, but of course, the other countries should also take this practice into consideration, and there should be minimum cost to the migrant workers.
Yeah, indeed. I imagine sometimes those costs can run pretty high with a lower volume of flights available. And of course, there's often testing that goes into it. It could be probably a lengthy affair to leave the country, but also to get permission to return for some countries. You also mentioned that employment, of course, is linked to migration status in many countries, including my country and in the country I live in. But to immediately lose your legal status, does that also mean in some contexts you also lose your ability to access healthcare in the country that you're living in and working in?
Yes, so it depends. Like it links to your employment status, especially the low skilled, semi-skilled, domestic worker categories. They don't have access to these schemes at all, and they are rarely covered by countries' labor laws. So
yeah. Well, not just in relation to domestic workers who might be in a greater risk of trafficking than perhaps other classes of migrant laborers. I'm interested in the measures that governments that could be taken, that aren't being taken now, but that could be taken by governments to ensure the safe and regular migration post-COVID-19, particularly around trafficking issues, but more broadly as well. What are some of these measures that should be or could be taken?
Okay. To take Sri Lanka has quite a robust regulatory framework when it comes to labor migration. The Sri Lanka Bureau for Foreign Employment Act very broadly covers the registration of migrant workers and the licensing of recruitment agents and their protection and welfare. Sri Lanka also has a comprehensive national labor migration policy and a national sub-policy on return and reintegration. I feel that these instruments need to be reviewed, especially in a pandemic situation like this. These instruments need to be reviewed, and the action plans should definitely factor the ongoing challenges into consideration, and the responses need to be formed accordingly. So to take Sri Lanka and the migrant workers who are in destination countries, especially in the Gulf region, immediate needs. There are immediate needs. There are medium-term needs and long-term needs. Immediately, what would be needed is, access to basic services that can be coordinated through the Ministry of Foreign Relations and the embassies, consulates. They would want access to health services before their departure, before their repatriations.
Right.
The flights need to be arranged, and then the PCR testings, medical screenings have to be facilitated. And at the point of entry, at the moment, there are 46 government quarantine centers are in operation. Any passenger who arrives in Sri Lanka have to go through a period of mandatory quarantine between 14 to 21 days. So these facilitates need to be strengthened, and not only immediately upon their arrival, but about the socio-economic impact and how they're going to sustainably reintegrate to the society. Stimuli packages and relief packages are needed because most of them are hard hit by economic losses. And then when it comes to reintegration, I'm more broadly look at not only the economic reintegration, but also the social, psychosocial domains of reintegration. And these should broadly be covered in the government's response plans.
Excellent. Thank you very much for this very concrete ideas for the way forward. We're going to come back to some of those, I think, in our question and answer period, since I'm seeing a number of questions pop up along those lines. And thank you so much, Manali.
Thank you. Thank you.
Cheers. Now, a key item of discussion among policymakers, business leaders, and civil society champions these days is the role of business in building back better. In fact, some say that business may be in the lead to help with that recovery, and it makes perfect sense. They generate value, they generate jobs, they generate revenues that provide for the essential services that some of us take for granted, many of those of us who are not migrant laborers, for example. As many of you know, business is working with government to design and implement policies that reduce risk of harm to migrants, while also benefiting and stoking economies to do the very best in terms of reaching their capacities for gainful employment, for value generation. We're grateful to be joined today by the Deputy Secretary General, Mr. Matthias Torns of the International Organization of Employers, or IOE. He's based in Geneva here. In his role as DSG, Matthias supports the global business community in its representation to the UN, but also to the G20 and to the G7. Welcome, Matthias.
Thank you. Good morning and greetings from Geneva here in Switzerland.
Yes.
Our members are the National Business and Employers Federation in 150 countries around the world, representing more than 50 million companies. These national member federations has been very much engaged on issues linked to migration for a long time, but now during COVID, they are focused particularly, I think, on two issues. The first one is keeping workers safe, domestic workers as well as migrant workers, and avoiding the spread of the virus. And Anna and others have said already, housing is of course a challenge which needs to be looked at and which is continuously a problem where we need to do better. Another issue have been how to ensure that essential workers from cross-border contexts, for instance, in the health sector, for instance, with regard to the agro-food, can still access their workplace despite of the closing of the borders. So this was also a strong focus of our members during the crisis. The IOE itself hosts the Business Advisory Group on Migration, which is a voice of business at the GFMD, the Global Forum on Migration and Development, which has a particularly working group on the impact of COVID on migration. And indeed, the IOE is co-hosting this working group. The IOE has been very much engaged on 4 issues. The first one is to ensure legal pathways for migration, ethical recruitment, innovative technology, and skill matching. In particular, the first 2, ethical recruitment, as well as ensuring legal pathways for migration, are particularly important, of course, to ensure that the most vulnerable workers are safe, that they don't end up in human trafficking, that they don't end up in forced labor situations, that they don't end up in the informal sector where the decent work deficits are the highest. We are very much engaging at the moment in a project with the Swiss and UK government on remittances, how to make sure that remittances keep flowing during the crisis. And we're looking into the question, what are the particular challenges and how to overcome them. And finally, with the support of the Swiss government, we are establishing focal points in the Asian Employers Federation on migration to increase peer learning between them, to keep them up to date what is coming from the global level, and also that gives them the possibility to share the experience.
Excellent. Well, that is a big plate of different interventions, of different work streams. I'm wondering if you could tell us quickly where you're making the most traction with regards to the reception from government and maybe even results. Is there one of those work streams that is further along than the others?
I think, there are still long ways to go in all of these work streams to be completely open. And what we fear at the moment is that because of the pandemic, that governments will be much more restrictive in the migration policies, that they will take much more protective measures on migration, which would be exactly the wrong thing to do. In order to come out of the crisis, in order to address the employment and economic impact of COVID-19, you need open and dynamic labor market. And migration, of course, labor market in line with labor market needs is a key role to play to have this open and dynamic labor market. It's also very important to keep this open because migration anyway will happen. But what will happen if you have a restrictive protectionist approach is that these migrants will be not registered. They will go informal, and then they will end up in this situation which no one wants. One issue which we have learned is that migrants which are in the informal economy are not covered by any kind of social protection, no access to healthcare. And this is exactly what we need to avoid in getting the frameworks right, right? So going forward, what we really need to do and what we are trying still to do is post-COVID to make sure that we don't have more restrictive migration policies, but more open migration policies to ensure that there are legal pathways, to make sure, to address the informal sector. And the informal sector, particularly in the Asian region, is huge. And this huge problem, of course, for all kinds of workers, but particularly for the migrant workers who don't have the network at home in the country, the network in the countries where, in the host countries, and which depend very much actually for support. And finally, we have also to look much more on skills matching to make sure that migrant workers have the skills which are needed in the host country as well as at home. And Humong has already alerted to that. So I think that are key priorities when going out of the crisis to make a better normal, the new normal.
Yeah, indeed. And Kun Sunwani also made note of the need to skill match between employers are looking for workers and migrant workers and others that are currently out of work. So it's actually a common theme in the conversation so far. It's skills matching and employment matching. With regards to post-COVID-19, let's say that these countries are now truly opening up and what have you. What changes do you think you see coming in the wake of COVID-19? We're talking about more restrictions now. Do you think countries will be suddenly willing to open up the migration, their migration regulations, or do you think we're going to be hunkered down for a long time with more restrictive measures?
Yeah, as said, we really hope that we will not see this restrictive protectionist approach that we feared, but we really hope, and that is what we're working on. I think there are key issues which are the lessons learned of the crisis, and the portability of social protection, the portability of pension, which was already addressed by several speakers in the panel, is one of that, where we need really now to make progress. And we really hope that the crisis might be a how do you call it, a kickstart to that, to have much more engagement on that. So that is certainly something we will look at. It is also the frameworks at national level, the fact that your resident status you will lose when you lose your employment status is something which really now we look again at it, right? We have made huge progress in many countries, like for Qatar, where the IEE together with the ITUC, the International Trade Union Confederation, has made great progress actually to end the kafala system. It was abolished at the beginning of the year, and we need to make further progress in other regions around the world on that. That is no question about that.
I hear from colleagues that you're doing a lot of work on ethical recruitment in particular. Could you just, with the remaining couple minutes we have left, could you give us some top line comments on the progress made on ethical recruitment?
I think there's a lot of progress, to be honest. Ethical recruitment is one of the hot topics at the moment. You see many initiatives looking at that. Companies are really focusing on this issue. We just had with the ILO a very well attended global webinar with the Business Network on Forced Labor of the ILO, which of course has a key focus on that. The IE within the GFMD is focusing very much on that. I think the challenge is more now how to get the nitty-gritty things in daily life under control, right? If you are a company in the Middle East and you very much depend on migrant workers on a quickly coming over, how to ensure that these migrant workers never paid for this job. I think so. These are now the challenges where we have to make more progress. We need innovative solutions for that. Also, digitalization can certainly help. If you have a transparent process through digital means, through online means, where employers are more and quicker able to get their staff, it is much more transparent. So that certainly will help. And the IE is sponsoring a startup competition for the last GFMD, but also for the upcoming GFMD, to look into these kind of solutions. There are many other innovative ideas, like the IRIS program with the IOM, together with the I Launch, where we are part of it, to see where we can certify the agencies, the recruitment agencies, to make sure that the employer who then uses an recruitment agencies can be sure that the workers didn't pay for these jobs. But we need to scale up these approaches. And one thing is clear: the more we have on the journey, then there's a bigger market actually. If there's a bigger market for ethical recruitment, more recruitment agency actually will be certified against IRIS and as other initiatives. That is very much where we're very much looking at.
Thank you, Matthias. That was very comprehensive. And in fact, if you notice, I'm looking down at some of the questions that are coming through because we're now in our question and answer period with about half an hour to go. Very proud of us for staying on time and giving our audience the space to ask the questions and hear your answers. Matthias, there's questions have come in on what are the best practices that can be shared for businesses to help migrants. I think you've answered some of those. Is there anything further, just starting off the question and answer period, is there anything further that advice you would give to businesses that may or may not be members of IOE or employers federations at the national level to ensure that migrants are treated well, but also are willing and able to come back to work once the economy is up and running again?
I think there's one rule for companies, and that is the basic rule is, as I always say, treat your migrant worker as you would like your daughter to be treated in a company. And that is a starting point, which is a very basic rule. At the end of the day, it's make sure that your migrant worker didn't pay to get the job. Make sure the migrant worker was aware of the regulation, was aware of the circumstances of the working conditions before he entered into the contract, right? That he was aware what is the pay, what are the working times. So he is very much aware what he can expect when coming to you in the workplace. It is also critical to engage two employers organizations to improve the framework conditions, right? Because as we heard from many here, it is often not so much a company, but it's the framework conditions which are challenging. If a migrant worker is losing the permit to stay, then you have to end the working relationship. It's a huge problem for an employer, right? You don't want to do that to the migrant workers, but it might be for any kind of reason that you don't just have a job for him right now, right? So you need to work on the framework conditions for these. Access to justice, it was mentioned by Anna and Sanwani, is really important. Going to court is most likely not a problem or not a solution. Sorry, it's not a solution for most of the migrant workers. They don't have the money, they don't have the information how to do that, they don't have the time, right, if they have to leave. So to have easy, accessible boards, mediation boards where they can go to is important, right? Which are trusted by the employers, but which are also trusted by the migrant workers. These are key facets, and these are the framework conditions we need to work on, and there the National Employers Federation have a key role to play.
Thank you, Matthias. If I may go to another question, this one for Minoli. This person asks, while the impact on the migrant workers is multifold, what has been your experience in terms of impact on the families, especially on children and minors? This question has actually come up twice, but we're going to put it to you, Minoli, for your initial response.
Hello, yeah, Sean.
Yes.
So in general, when a migrant worker migrates for employment, it certainly has impact on families, and it's indeed an area to be looked into, especially during the pandemic. As I mentioned earlier, there are issues communicating with the families, and also in terms of loss of income, how the remittances, in terms of transmitting the remittances, how these families can be supported. So there are serious concerns around those issues as well. And within the country, children can be exploited in various means. There are increased risk of online exploitation. So these are some of the areas that should be taken into consideration, especially by the child protection authorities in the country of origin as well.
We have another question here. Thank you very much, Minoli. We have another question here related to children. I just thought maybe it's a little bit more detailed. Maybe I will put this to Anna for a more regional view. Excuse me while I scroll through. There's been a lot of very pointed questions here. Forgive me 1 second. Oh, I've lost track of it. So many questions on my
Vad hände? Tog vårt internet?
That's about how governments like Kuwait have made airfare available. What about businesses covering airfare? We haven't heard a lot about that. I mean, as a business sees demand drop through the floor, I'm guessing it's hard for them to also afford to pay for flights of migrants back home. But in some ways, there is that mutually beneficial relationship, Matthias, that you spoke of earlier about treating your migrant workers as you would someone from your own family in the factory. Are there businesses that are covering airfares and travel for return? And here's a second more pointed question. This is not really towards Matthias, but for the whole group. Many workers have not been paid wages for many months now. How can they access their unpaid wages, gratuities, etc.? How will businesses ensure access to justice and provide remedy measures for migrant workers? So maybe I'll ask Matthias if you could just a quick answer whether there are some businesses providing airfare, but then I'd like to move to Anna about the access to justice question.
I want to first actually ask the issue, address the issue about unpaid wages. The issue,
please.
of course, is that many companies face business continuity with challenges, right? According to the ILO, more than 430 million companies are in severe risk actually to go bankrupt. Many of these companies don't have any work to give, right? So workers are not working. There are no social protection schemes, no unemployment benefits, and this is not only linked to migrant workers, that is generally, and that's the reason why the IUE together with the ITUC launched a major initiative for the garment sector, where we have in many countries in Asia actually the challenge that we see a humanitarian catastrophe. Workers out of work without any kind of coverage, any kind of social protection income scheme. So this is a challenge which is not only linked to migrant workers, but generally to workers. And this is not so much linked actually to a company not paying wages, but they just can't because they don't have any income. But it's more linked to the issue about social protection schemes, unemployment schemes, income support schemes at national level, where you really need now as a lesson learned of the crisis to step up and build up sustainable social protection schemes at national level. That is really the lessons learned from this crisis. Now, coming to the question about airfare, which is very specific, at the end of the day, yes, for sure companies are doing that. It also depends again on the framework conditions. If that is a legal requirement that you have to bring back your migrant worker, which has been in your country, which you don't have any work anymore for it, then of course it will be done. But it really depends also on the national context. Thank you.
Absolutely. National context is almost always the determinant factor in these kinds of questions. And forgive me, a very specific question, but you answered it with aplomb. Now, to Anna, let me repeat what the second half of the question. Many workers have not been paid wages for months. How do they access their unpaid wages, gratuities? How will businesses ensure access to justice and provide, let me say, I'm sorry, how will governments, businesses, and multilateral organizations ensure access to justice and provide remedy measures for migrant workers? Anna?
Thank you. Well, that's a tough question, I have to say, because maybe to reiterate a bit what Matthias was saying, I mean, this issue of unpaid wages, etc., it's not only about migrant workers, it's about workers in general in this current situation, and it is a major challenge. I mean, we have, I mean, perhaps not linked to the COVID crisis, but I mean, we have seen that there are ways for migrants to have access to justice. It's just by putting these mechanisms in place have been quite successful. We have, I mentioned earlier very briefly, we have been setting up these migrant worker resource centers. We're supporting, I think, 28 of those in 6 countries in the ASEAN region. And together with trade unions and civil society and organizations like CTOM, for example, working with recruitment agencies and governments, we are able to negotiate with employers and others so that unpaid wages, overcharged recruitment costs and fees are paid back to migrant workers. And in a period of 7-8 years, the work that we have been doing under the ILO migration projects, more than $4 million have in fact been ordered in compensation to migrant workers through mechanisms. That is quite impressive, and I think, I mean, that shows that by by having these having local legal assistance in place, you can achieve quite a bit. So, but of course, in the end, government needs to step in, and I think Thailand has established a good example that I'd like to share. The government has set up 10 migrant workers assistance centers throughout the country, where migrants are also able to go straight to the government, to the Ministry of Labor, and seek assistance. There are some issues with those, but I mean that there are also government mechanisms in place that can be further replicated and looked at for good examples.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for those insights. I want to turn now to a question addressed to Umang. One fear is that migrant workers have no choice but to work in dangerous workplaces. You know this well, Umang. Many migrants from Burma are working, for example, in agriculture or food processing sectors in some countries, and the risk of infection in these spaces is very high. What can businesses and governments do about these sectors to protect migrant workers? What would you tell corporations? What would you tell them to do if they have supply chains, factories, farms in the region? I'm not seeing or hearing Umang at this time. Though his name, okay. Well, you know what? That's a question that equally valid to Kun Sunwani. Sunwani, assuming you've heard me, I'm happy to repeat the question. But do you mind taking this on in the while Umang reconnects?
Okay, and can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so actually, like, it has been a discussion among our partner, like migrant working group partners as well, that migrant will, like, when there are illegal after the whole days of being unemployed, that they wanted more money so that they will be entering into like harmful work and even sex work. And so there's a high possibility, especially when they do not have the proper documentation. And we also that they are more at risk to be labor exploited and be put in situation of forced labor or even trafficking in person situation.
Thank you very much. And Sunwani, do you have experience working with the migrant workers resource centers, and are you also happy with while they might have challenges with the services they're providing?
Okay, so to be frank, like Raksai has been working closely with the Migrant Resource Center and Surat Thani, and it has been a good collaboration, but I would say that it's mainly due to the officer over there that quite active. I mean, the government officer that quite active, but the whole mechanism is not quite supporting, because it's I think it's only under the management of Department of Employment, but the issues of labor protection is falling under many departments under the Ministry of Labor. So like sometimes it's quite a complication to get the information, because like those who are under the employment department would not know the information for that other department is in charge. So it's not truly to be one-stop service in practice that we aim it to be. Yeah.
One-stop service provision is difficult in many settings. I've worked on access to justice issues in 3 different regions now, and they are difficult models to support and sustain. But I'm glad to hear that you've had some positive experiences, and I note that Anna seems to be listening attentively, and acknowledges that the centers may have challenges as well. So thank you for that response. It's a question for everyone now. Migrant workers are engaged in providing urgent services as well. Sometimes that's actually domestic work. It certainly has been in the case of my household, where children are no longer in school and the parents are at home, or rather are working, but on webinars and what have you. But they're also engaged in medical support and hospital services. Do we know? Does anyone know out there if there's been a study to show or to know the impact of on these workers? In some cases, they truly are frontline, working, in hospitals, on different ends of the hospitals or inside the hospitals. Do we have any studies about some of these frontline workers and/or workers working in a domestic setting? Let me see if there's can I see a hand from anyone who'd like to answer that question?
I assume the point is that frontline workers at the end of the day, there's no difference whether they're domestic or migrant, right? They face certain risks, being it in the health sector, being it in retail, being it in whatever sector it is, right? So you will have a lot of studies focusing on what are the risks for health workers. And there is, of course, a lot of studies, how many nurses are infected by corona and so on and so forth,
Sure.
how many retail, but I don't think there's a differentiation made in, where these coming from.
You've noted that there isn't that differentiation. I'm wondering, is there any value to having a study that differentiates the impact? Are they less likely to get services? One question that's out there that I haven't gotten to yet is whether there's been indications of migrant workers being deprioritized in getting services, even where it's legal, even where they seek them. They've been deprioritized. There's been some discrimination in these provision of these services. Would that kind of study be valuable? Anyone have any thoughts? Looks like, who is that? Oh, Matthias is, please. I'm sorry, I can't see everyone at the same time. Go ahead.
No worries. I think what would be valuable to have are studies in how far migrant workers actually help to support economies, being it in the health sector, being it with regard to other essential services, because this is really then making the impact and making the argument for why we do need regular pathway for migration, why we need to keep borders open in and past COVID, right? I think it turn it a bit around. I would really find it interesting, important to have studies in how far migrant workers have, particularly during the COVID crisis, helped economies to keep running in what kind of function ever.
Thank you for that, Matthias. I see Umang is back. Picking up on that comment and that question I was posing, have there been reports from the people you're speaking with, migrant laborers you're speaking with, whether that's in Myanmar or in Thailand, where they've experienced discrimination in the provision of essential services?
For us, no, we haven't had any complaint. There may be because of our irregularity, but I would say at the moment for this pandemic, for this crisis, I would say the responses has been pretty good, pretty fair.
Okay, that's really excellent to hear. I'm being someone who lives in Thailand, I'm always struck by the provision that's available, or rather the services that are available here, and professionalism. And I'm glad to know that you haven't yet heard of those of any discrimination yet, or I haven't heard of discrimination. And though in fact you may you admit that your information base, it's not a clean data set, it's uneven in some way. Sunwani, did I see you raising your hand?
Yes. Since we have a big program working on health promotion, like Stop TB and HIV in many provinces across the country, we have received some complaint from the TB and HIV positive patient that we have been following up on their cases, and we find that there's a limitation since the hospital implement the preventive measures, like there's so many screening and question asking, but that's not enough language that provide in migrant language, so that's caused very complication for migrants who wanted to receive health care at the government hospital. So we find that by not providing adequate information or like providing information in migrant language is a part of discrimination.
I have a question for Manoli coming up, but while I have Umang here, there's just a question from an old friend of mine, so I want to give her a shout out to Miwa Yamada. How does CTUM support migrant workers going and coming back?
Well, we've been working on the migration since '96. I also was a migrant in Thailand for about 20 years. So we do know the situations. And we used to have a migrant center in Mahachai area, but because we returned back to Burma, we stopped doing that. But we still have, let's say, activities going on together with the Thai trade unions, because we have an MOU between the trade unions with the, let's say, with the Thai TTUC, LTC, and other the CERC. So we are working with the Thai trade unions on a union-to-union basis to support the, let's say, the migrant workers. We try to provide translation, or in many cases, try to get legal representation through the HRDF, and also, let's say, the research institutes like with the Chula Institute, Asia Institute, and things like that. So that's the kind of things that we've been doing. And when they come back, we try to now, let's say, we have stopped our post-arrival monitoring, but we are now trying to integrate into this, let's say, post-COVID integration, reintegration into the community. So that's what we've been doing. We've been going to all the border, most of the border checkpoints, trying to provide the, let's say, the logistics for the volunteers who are working to receive the returning migrants. So that's a kind of job that we've been doing within the last 3 months.
Thank you. And if I can pass a similar question off to Manoli, how to accommodate or rehabilitate, how to accommodate or rehabilitate the returning migrant worker. Serious unemployment back home. What is IOM advising? Is IOM in the business of advising on that front? Perhaps you can give us some thoughts, either from a personal standpoint, professional standpoint, or from an institutional standpoint, Manoli.
Okay. Sorry, Sean, I lost you, I think, at the beginning of the question. If you can repeat the question, I think that would be great.
Sure, I think many of you did. I got a message, my connection was unstable. How to accommodate or rehabilitate the returning migrant worker? How is Sri Lanka doing that? And perhaps what can IOM do with its partners?
Okay. So in Sri Lanka, especially at IOM, we have a program called Assisted Voluntary Return and Reintegration Program. Also, we closely work with IOM missions and also embassies and consulates abroad. We support governments and provide technical advice, especially in these mass repatriation processes. So from the point of, from the destination country to the country of origin, as I mentioned earlier, to the quarantine centers and back to the community. Most of them have suffered economic losses and they don't have any livelihood opportunities. So developing the entrepreneurship skills, upskilling, reskilling, and recognizing the qualifications that they have gained, the experiences that they have gained in destination countries, and transforming it to the labor market in Sri Lanka will be some of the key aspects that the Sri Lanka Bureau for Foreign Employment, the Ministry of Foreign Employment, and the government can look into. So after they reintegrate, after they return to Sri Lanka, it's not only about reintegration, some might want even remigrate. So a solid policy, a concrete policy should be in place to motivate these employers, the employees, the migrant workers to remigrate and to especially recognize their skills.
Thank you. Now, everyone, we have just a few minutes to go. There have been a lot of questions. I would try to accommodate them all if I could, because they are all very interesting. I want to just send a message of appreciation to the audience for thinking their questions through, and apologies for not being able to answer them all. We do have a record of your questions, though, and we'll provide them to our speakers who may be able to respond to you if you leave us if you've registered with your email. They might be willing to respond to you in the coming days and weeks. I think it's been a very rich discussion, and I'm sorry to have to bring it to a close with just a few moments left. Allow me, if you would, the liberty of just going over some key themes or themes that I thought were particularly important here as we answer the question, how do we build back better with migrant workers in mind post-COVID-19? Among the strongest and recurring themes has been the need to focus on social protection. I won't elaborate into why it's almost self-evident, and the of course, I forget the term now, I'll just move on. From social protection to access to justice. I wasn't expecting access to justice and or access to remedy to come out so singularly and so strongly from both our speakers and from the questions and answers that were posed. The need for information dissemination, I think Sunwani placed an emphasis on that, and the need to update and or review the instruments in place to protect and ensure safe migration. Of course, Manoli mentioned that, but Umang also noted that our MOU between Thailand and Myanmar needs to be updated as well. Other key themes included focus perhaps on housing and migrant housing, but also I thought it was interesting that skills matching was referenced by a number of different speakers, at least 3, and also came up in our question box there. The use of the migrant worker resource centers, of course, it's been around for some time, and we know that there's a powerful both powerful services are providing now and powerful potential to realize going forward. And perhaps COVID-19 has opened up an opportunity to redouble our efforts in making sure that those one-stop centers work for everyone and equally. Post-COVID, a call for a more open migration from IOE, for more open migration regulatory framework. That's desperately needed it's needed year in, year out. In post-COVID-19, it remains to be seen what political will and appetite there is for this. But with your voices alongside ours here at UNDP and wider civil society, workers, trade unions, workers groups, and coalitions of businesses, and not to mention governments, I think that we can build that political will. I want to thank everybody today for being a part of this important panel, and I'm looking forward to taking this conversation forward in the weeks and months to come. So thank you very much for attending, and to our speakers, thank you for your interventions today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.